So as we zoom in now and talk a little bit about more of the reality on the ground in a land very far away, I wanted to start by talking about what probably dominated the news, particularly out of Israel in the first half of the year, which was the Netanyahu government's plans for annexation, which it really found itself on its own in pursuing that. It got sometimes tepid, sometimes more enthusiastic support from America, but otherwise it was pretty much on its own, and it was really only the end of a process of expansion of settlements, the entrenchment of the occupation. How do you think things got to that point where Israel used to be more of a consensus issue around the world? Things never really got too out of hand, that Israel kind of felt itself isolated on what was a major campaign promise from someone who had been prime minister for 10 years?
Well, those of us who have been passionate supporters of Israel throughout our lives, and I don't have a drop of Jewish blood in my veins, by the way, but it's a question of conviction for a whole bunch of reasons, not least of which is the experience of the Holocaust and the horror of it. From the get-go, with the Palestine Commission of 47-48, headed by one of my foreign ministerial predecessors, Herbert Vierevet, this was a recommendation for a two-state solution from the get-go. So the basis of the vote in the UN General Assembly, all 50 of us back then, to create Israel, was on the conditionality of a two-state solution. So if you have an historical prism on these things, that was the basis in international law upon which we proceeded. And therefore, when we look at the rights of the Palestinians, it's always been part and parcel of the equation for practically all states, including those who put their hand up to vote yes for Israel in that critical vote way back when. First positive vote for Israel, as you know, was Australia, for alphabetic reasons, I think, in the roll call that day.
But very much taught in all our Jewish day schools still, so a moment of pride.
Yeah, well, it's interesting when you watch the footage of it, because the then Labor government of Australia, under Prime Minister Chifley and Bert Ebbett, was particularly activist in mobilising support for that vote. And, you know, some of the anti-Semitism, which was still kicking around parts of the US and the UK at the time, were a little less forward-leading than we were. Anyway, that's history. Roll on to the present. I've had many meetings with Bibi over the years, as Prime Minister, as Foreign Minister, and as Joe's citizen. And I reluctantly formed the conclusion, probably about a decade ago, a bit less, probably 8 or 9 years ago, that Bibi would do anything to prevent landing a two-state solution. Right. Even if Palestinians, even if Fatah, even if the entire Palestinian leadership were to sign up to an acceptable compact on the final status questions, the usual list, that I experienced this firsthand. Bibi would shift the goalposts in order to kick that off into the sand. And so I think Bibi, from the get-go, has had a view that whatever it took to derail either the Oslo process or everything that succeeded it, including John Kerry's Herculean efforts in the last days of the Obama administration, that he was not just not committed, he was actively hostile. Right. So I think that Netanyahu has always had it somewhere tucked away in his cerebral cortex, that he wants on his tomb this inscription, which is, I killed the two-state solution. And I think you're right. He got the shock of his life when, you know, I came out relatively clearly opposed to it. But he got the shock of his life when the Australian government, the Conservative government, were not cheering from the rafters either. So I think it's what we call in politics and foreign policy classic overreach. I hope he learns from it, but I know he won't. He's Bibi.
Right. I mean, there's, his kind of obstructionism, like you said, goes all the way back to Oslo. There's those that famous rally that he held standing on the balcony looking over Zion Square in Jerusalem, where there were all kinds of death threats and incitement underneath against Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. Of course, we all know how that ended, and many people on the left in Israel continue to hold Netanyahu at least kind of partially responsible for the mood in the country that led to that assassination. And like you said, it's been kind of an ongoing process since then. So to get back to what you were talking about before, this kind of bedrock of support that Israel has in Australia, but also around the world, is largely, I think, based around shared democratic values as well. This idea that Israel is a liberal democratic state and therefore is a natural partner in a region where there certainly aren't that many. So the occupation, and if it went through annexation as a permanent occupation, significantly erodes those democratic foundations. What happens at some point when Australian governments and other governments around the world, friendliest governments to Israel, like the United States post-Trump, maybe European governments, when they kind of realize, hang on a second, the occupation is permanent. There are millions of people living in sovereign Israel effectively without citizenship. They can't vote. They don't have due process. What do these governments do? What does a government like Australia do when they realize that the occupation is now permanent?
Well, if Netanyahu was allowed to get away with it, and as you know, at the time of the diplomatic normalization with the United Arab Emirates, Netanyahu said it's still on the table,
right,
still on the cards, and I read that very carefully.
Yeah.
Then a number of people have been actively debating what would then happen in terms of international action against Israel. And the first thing that would come to mind, including on the part of friendly governments, would be a range of sanctions. The application of sanctions regimes in international law as they've applied to, for example, the Russian invasion of Crimea, what happened with Kosovo, and what happened with other states around the world. There's a fairly long set of precedents here. And there would be a bunch of states, I'm not saying Australia would necessarily be one of them, who would then raise up the flagpole this question, which is, if you think through a de jure act, you can validate your de facto actions through the settlements program, etc., over a long period of time, then, hey, sunshine, you got another thing coming. We're not coming with you on this bus. And I think that's, we may get onto this later in the conversation, but I have a very good and long-standing and friendly personal relationship with the leadership of the UAE, MBZ and Sheikh Abdullah, the foreign minister, and Dr. Anwar, the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs. And I think their role, frankly, in pulling Israel back from this brink could well be one of the most important contributions made. Hopefully it remains there after Bibi has finally decided to slide off into retirement, forced or voluntary.
Right, either retirement or jail retirement, depending maybe on how his corruption cases go. I do want to kind of press you a little bit on it and then definitely come back to the UAE. What should Australia do beyond, is sanctions, the argument I've heard around sanctions is that Australia placed it on Russia, but would not place it on Israel because Australia has obviously a different relationship with Israel than it does with Putin's Russia, therefore no sanctions. And I've also heard the flip side of the argument that Australia has a special relationship with Israel, therefore the either threat or actual imposition of sanctions carries a lot more weight and would be more powerful at them bringing Israel back. Do you subscribe to kind of either theory?
Well, I suppose my approach and why I entered this debate back in June is, how do you prevent the Israelis from doing this? Right. How do you prevent the Netanyahu government from doing it? prevention is far better than cure, and politics and international relations quite apart from medicine. So let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. Our focus now should be on precisely that. And as I indicated before, maybe Netanyahu would have assumed that someone like myself would have put their hand up and said, as a former Prime Minister of this country, but from the centre left, and saying, no way, Jose. But I think they would have been, Likud would have been stunned to see the Australian Conservative government dragged kicking and screaming into a similar position.
Right.
And if you can't bring the Australian Conservatives with you on something like this, I'm not sure who is left outside, the governor of Louisiana on a bad day, after scripture class on a Sunday morning, So I think our focus should still be there, and together with Israel's, friends now in the Arab world, the Emiratis, the Egyptians, and the Jordanians. I think this is a really important coalition of interest. On the hypothetical that you pose, and what happens if he goes down this route, what could and would Australia do? I think it would be very difficult for any Australian government, Conservative or Labor, to simply dismiss out of hand a case made in international law for sanctions. Let's just say the United States would veto any such approach in the UN Security Council. But let's just say these matters would then became justiciable in other international fora. Given the extensive precedents in international law, going back, if you like, to the Palestine Commission, the validation from the get-go of a two-state solution in 47-48, and given the other precedents, of which Russia and Crimea is only the most recent of stacks of others, once you throw away that principle in international law about turning an occupation into a legal annexation, then you are changing international law at that point. And I'm not sure the international community is up for that. And I say that for someone who's personally deeply and bitterly opposed the entire BDS movement. Like, I don't like that stuff. I really don't, because you don't have to be a huge historian of the 1930s to understand what Kristallnacht was all about. But let me tell you, I don't favour this idea of targeting Jewish businesses around the world because you don't happen to like the Likud government in Israel or its policies. But when you're dealing with international law between states, I think the debate around sanctions, upholding the principle of the inviolability of states, then becomes very difficult to just dismiss.